Benbow. You've been on the Ffoton hit list, I've got to say, from the very, very start, when we were exploring what photographers we could talk to in Wales. But we couldn't find you, was the main thing. You've been a man in hiding, I think, for many years. But I think you're a key part of the story of contemporary photography in Wales. And I know that it's not just me saying that, there's many, many still working photographers will attest to that. But the thing that really interests me is what brings a PE teacher to Wales back in the 70s.
Okay, well, I was born in Birmingham and I went to Loughborough College to become a teacher, a PE teacher, and which I did for 3 years, which I enjoyed very much. And then I became a PE teacher at a school called Countersthorpe College, which is in Leicestershire. Countersthorpe was a really interesting school. It was sort of modelled on the school called Summerhill, which was started by A.S. Neal. It's a very sort of liberal school in terms where his philosophy was to say that the students could decide whether they went to class or not, and pretty much how they conducted themselves in the school. So there were no set lessons, and the kids had an awful lot of freedom. So I really enjoyed it there because although you were in the confines of a school, you had an awful lot of freedom. And I worked there for a few years. I had a friend who was also a teacher, which I shared digs with, a guy called Barry Lewis, and he was very keen on photography, and he kept talking to me about photography. And I obviously I was interested in some of his pictures, so I'd ask him a few questions. And he said, "Why don't you come along to Leicester University's darkroom? In the evening I go there and I process black and white, and you can have a look." So I went along and, saw these images magically coming out of this tray that he was jiggling about. I thought, wow, this is interesting. I might want to get into this. So I started finding out a bit more about photography, and I was talking to him, and I suddenly realised, well, I could use this thing, photography, as a way of travelling, really, and a way of exploring the world, because as far as I understand it, that's what you can do with this thing called a camera. And
so was that really your introduction? Was Barry Lewis then? Oh, showing you?
Yes. Barry, who as you may know, went on to be a very, very good photographer, magazine and feature photographer, very good. But he wasn't he went on to the Royal College before he started freelancing. But at this stage, he was just a very keen amateur. But he was very good technically. He was he knew about the chemicals of photography and all that, which I didn't know, and I wasn't that interested really. I was more interested in what you can do as a photographer, and where you were able to go, and the passport that it gave you. That's what interested me. Not that I didn't really care about the f-stops on a camera. Anyway, he said, well, there's only really two colleges. There's this one at Trent, run by Trent Polytechnic, run by a guy called Paul Hill, and there's another new one that's not long started in Newport, run by a photographer called David Hurn. So I found out about them. I went for an interview at Trent, met a very nice guy there called Paul Hill who ran that. I thought, well, this is interesting. But I think that was like 2 or 3 years, and I thought, well, I don't want to go back to college for another 3 years. I won't get a grant because I've had a grant by teaching. So then I hitchhiked down to Newport and had an interview with David Hurn and the other lecturer there,
John Charity.
John Charity, who was a younger guy, but he'd been a working freelance himself, so he was very experienced as well. And David obviously experienced at a higher level. And they were running it was the second year of the course that I was going to be interviewed for. They had very few students on very few. I think the first year they only had about 6, I think. This year they were looking to have about 8 or 10. It was a 1-year course. They were only going to do black and white. They weren't going to teach you anything technical, but they were going to teach you how to be a photographer. I thought, well, that's the kind of thing that I like to do. I hadn't got any pictures though, because I hadn't really done any. I'd done a few odd things around Leicester, but I didn't have a body of work that I could say, look, this is this interesting enough to get me on your course? So very quickly I went around the school where I was still at, and I took photographs of some of the students, and I interviewed them, and I got some comments from them as to how do you find this type of education that you're doing at this school, which is very liberal. You don't have to go to class if you don't want to. Do you think it's good for you? And I got some really interesting comments, and I put these on to an exhibition with the pictures. And I thought, okay, at least I've got some photography I can go and show them. And I took this down with me, and I must have bluffed my way through, but they did accept me. So I then was on the course at Newport. And so I went back to school, went in to see the headmaster, said, sorry, Head, but I'm going to do this photography course. I'm going to stop what I'm doing. He wasn't at all pleased, because I'd started some interesting new things on the course at the school. So anyway,
So this is 1976, I think, is the year you went on to the course, wasn't it?
76 I did, so I guess the first year would have been the 75 course. So I started at Newport, and met the other students, and it was a really interesting group of people there. There weren't that many, but they were coming from all different types of society. There was a businessman, there was a botanist, there was Clive Landon, who went on to become a lecturer on the course, actually. There was a guy from America, somebody who'd studied under a photographer over there that David knew. There was a miner. There was a couple of students, I think, that came over from fine art, one of them being Sue Packer, who went on to become a frighteningly talented portrait photographer. So it was a really interesting mix of people. So again, I say, it was a 1 year black and white, no flash, no technical, but because it had the two lecturers, David and John, because they'd both been working photographers, and David obviously still was to an extent, they had experience of how you become a photographer and how a photographer works, what's involved. Whereas as far as I could see, other places, maybe some of the universities, were teaching the technical aspect, how to go into studios, be a studio, or how to, use a 5.4 camera, which I had absolutely no interest in whatsoever. So it seemed to be a perfect course for me.
Was there any commonality in your peer group that year that you did the course in terms of their expectations of what job they would... I mean, everyone says it now, but don't they? It's so common because of Instagram and online. Yeah. I want to be a photographer, I want to be creative. But to go to that type of course, what was the profession and what was the next step for those students in terms of being a photographer?
I don't think that was ever mentioned.
No.
I don't remember it being saying, from this you can go into that. I don't remember that ever coming up, ever. It was all about photography. It was about learning who were the great photographers. We'd have lectures on all the great, not all, but most of the great photographers. We'd see their pictures. David and John would explain why they are good. Why is this photographer so good? Why is he better than this photographer? And also, why is this image good? And this was just stuff I hadn't got a clue about, but I was fascinated with it. Because also these photographers were photographing in the real world. They weren't photographing products they weren't. Some of it was technically good, some of it perhaps wasn't, but it didn't matter. It was what they were photographing and how they were photographing and the effect it had on the viewer. You didn't have to be explained what the picture was about. If you hadn't got it in 3 seconds, it was no good. So that was fascinating. And being subjected to all these incredible image makers was mind-blowing for me. But it was never, never said, okay, you're going to have to be a newspaper photographer or that. Because we were coming at it with different life skills, I think that was the important bit. We were using photography to document what we were interested in, be it, didn't matter, botany or sport, because if you approach photography in the right way, well, not the right way, there isn't a right way, but this particular way, which is quite simple, very methodical, you can use that to improve your photography in whatever genre you want to go into or not go into. So that was a thing behind the whole course, really, I think.
It's fascinating to think that that year you were on it, it was only a 1 year course. I think it eventually became 2, and then
I think it did.
It developed into the university course. But 1 year, I mean,
Yeah.
did you feel, was that enough time for you to learn a camera, exposure triangle, framing, the way you would approach the...
It was, and it wasn't. It was in the fact that I only wanted to spend a year, because I was desperate to get out. I was probably 25. I just wanted to get out and do it. So I needed the minimum amount that would enable me to do it and not make a total fool of myself, really. That's what I wanted, and that's what it gave me. Yes, with hindsight, maybe some... No, I don't know, because I learnt the technical stuff on the job, really. And if you keep it basic, there's not that much involved, really. As long as you work out that, if you're going to handhold a camera, you can't go below 60th of a second. Basics like that, most of it's pretty obvious, really. And you see, if your pictures aren't right or they're blurry or whatever, obviously the lecturers, David and John would explain why that's blurry or whatever, what you have to do. You have to balance your camera on a chair or something. So there were always workarounds, but they were simple, and the whole premise was keep it simple, stupid. And that philosophy has never left me, because I haven't had any other option, really. If I didn't keep it simple, I would have problems.
And I think something that I've heard from, I think you've said, and others that were on the course, was that you were rarely inside, you were always out shooting.
Oh yeah, we're out shooting every day. We'd have a project that we're going out to do, or an exercise, and we go out to shoot it, come back, process, sit down with either David or John. They would go through contact sheets, and they would explain, why this picture worked and the following one didn't, what we had to do, and if it didn't work, we'd go back and do it again and again and again, until it did work. By then we realised, okay, we know why it didn't work, we know what to do the next time, and we'll go do it right next time. And that's what we did, again, again, again.
The course at that time then, with the group that you were in, if there were only 2 lecturers, how did the course work? How much time were you getting with the teaching, and how much time were you out actually with a camera?
Well, we were out with a camera most of the time. We would be set projects. It was basically based around the putting together a photo story, with the end objective of the photo story being used in a spread in a magazine. That was like the ultimate. If you could get 2 or 3, 4 pages of photographs which showed a story, obviously there would be accompanying text to go with it to explain what was going on. But so to put that together required basically 3 elements. You had to have the establishing shot, which was generally tended to be a wide shot of the area, the event, the landscape, whatever the story was. Then you had to have a relationship shot, which perhaps showed the person that was the main person and that person interacting with another person. So you had that tended to be quite a tight shot. That was a relationship shot of two, well, possibly 2 or more people relating. Then you had a working shot, what was called a working shot, which was what was going on in the story. Now, obviously, it depended a lot on the story, but again, that tended to be perhaps quite a fairly tight shot. So those were the 3 elements that we tended to work on a picture story: the working shot, the relationship shot, and the establishing wide shot. Maybe a portrait if it was that if the story necessitated that. So we would go out, and the brief would be something like, we need some working shots. So you'd find a factory or somebody working somewhere, and you would shoot a lot of pictures of that particular thing. Then you'd come back, you'd process it, you'd do your contact sheets, you'd sit down with either David or John, and they'd go through it frame by frame as to why this image worked better than the one preceding or following it, and you discuss, everything about that particular. And then you'd mark it with a chinograph. I think you started marking white chinograph for ones that possibly worked, and then you'd edit it down to a yellow chinograph. So you eventually got, I think it was red. You got you got your picture that worked best for that brief. So then, and the other thing was that you tended to shoot a lot of pictures of one subject. So in other words, once you decided what your picture was, and so maybe if it was relationship shop, you had the two people together. So you worked out the background, you worked out your angle, you worked out the lighting, all that. But because the chances are they were moving, every picture that you took would be slightly different. The hand could be in a slightly different position, or the head, or something would be different. So it's virtually impossible to look at a situation that went on for, say, 30 seconds and know when in that 30 seconds was going to be the time which created the best image of that. So the only way to do it was shoot a lot of pictures and then edit and pick out the best one. So that was a way of working that was not drummed into you, but suggested this is what you have to do, because it's the only way of getting the best picture from that situation in front of you. And gradually you began to learn, okay, I understand why this image works and that one doesn't work. And it could be the tiniest, subtlest little thing, but it was different and it was better. And you learned that 99.9% of all your pictures didn't work, but occasionally, very occasionally, one would work. So we did that for the establishing shot, the working shot, the relationship shot, and then we could put those pictures together. I think the next step was then to do a working print, which was possibly a 5/7 print, I think it was 5/7 work prints. So then we'd print the selected prints from the contact sheets that we marked in white, and we'd print those up. So we could then lay them out on we had a massive big table in the room. We'd lay them out on there, and then either David or John would say, okay, right, now we can see these a bit better. We can see why this works. These are starting to work together. And we started to put the pictures together, and we could see why one didn't work and the next one did. And eventually we had a picture story. So we had the establishing shot, the working shot, and maybe a portrait. Oh, the other thing, of course, we bring the contact sheets back and we go through it. So, well, not bad, but you need to do it again. So we go back and we do it again.
Well, they would send you back out to shoot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. We go back and we do it again if it didn't work. Because, it's no good having a picture didn't work. So that we became aware that, okay, this has to work. And we began to learn why it didn't work. So the second time we went out, we didn't make those same mistakes. And gradually, you got better at doing it. The first time was just, okay. But I think the biggest difference, what I found, particularly when I left and I talked with other photographers, they weren't doing that. They weren't shooting a lot of pictures around, well, some of them were obviously, but I noticed a lot were shooting one or two pictures and then going on and shoot. So how can you possibly get the pictures if you're working in that way? So it was a method of working. That was the biggest thing, well, not the biggest thing, one of the important things I got from Newport was your method of working. And whatever I've done since then, whether I've been doing, colour or corporate or even video in a way, that was always in the back of my mind. You've got to get everything right and then keep shooting and shooting and shooting and then editing and picking out the pictures. The only way you're going to get, obviously, you can stumble across and take one frame and get a wonderful picture. That works occasionally, but consistently that won't work. I guess it's different with people that only do landscape, large format landscape. Maybe they work obviously a different way. But in a way they don't, because they'll probably wait 10 hours for the light to be right.
Yeah.
So in a way they are working the same way. But in the kind of reportage that we were doing, this was the only way of doing it. So that was a very, very important lesson.
So the course you were on then, and we're going back to, I think around about 75, 76, you would have been there, wasn't it? 76, maybe?
Yes, I was at, it was 76, yes.
It was a 1 year course.
It was just a 1 year course. I think then it went to 2.
Yeah.
It went to 2 years after I left, but certainly I was only there for a year. Yeah.
And do you think that worked, that structure, within a year, worked as a photography education course? Or could you have stayed longer?
It worked for me because I had enough then. Because you can learn the technical bits. You can talk to people, or you can go somewhere. How do I do bounce flash, or how do I do that? You can learn that. What you can't, but you can't learn the other stuff. So I learned the important stuff, and the other stuff, I had to learn. I had to learn about flash. I had to learn about color. I had to learn about all that stuff. I learned that on the job. I'd then go out on a newspaper or a job, and I think, okay, I can't get away with available light here, so I've got to bring in something else. But I learned that while I was doing it, which is, I think, the best way, because it's very different learning something in a college and going out when you're shooting somebody perhaps important. You've got 5 minutes, you've got to get it right. You can't go back, then you can't go back. So you keep it. And the other thing I learned, keep it simple. Absolutely. Keep your equipment simple, keep everything very simple, and do the same thing. So then you've got a good chance of getting something. The main thing, you must get something. You must get it in focus, show up, right. If you can get anything else, that's a bonus. But you've got to get something, because otherwise you won't get another job from that picture editor. That's a very important lesson I learned very early on. Don't screw up your first job.
So where were you on the course when you were studying? Where were you drawing inspiration from? Were the students, including yourself, looking at the newspapers, looking at the mag, look at what was being commissioned? What was that something basically that people were looking for?
We were having lectures as well. I mean, that's not all we did. There would be, David would give lectures about various photographers, about various, particularly how photographers worked. And this was a real strength of the course, because we had lecturers who'd done it. You had John Charity, who hadn't done as much as David, but he'd done enough to help you when you started, because he could help you with the, not smaller jobs, but the initial jobs. David could help you if you progressed to the higher level. So between the two of them, it was very good, because you then, okay, I can start like this, but if I get this, I can do this. And they could advise you on that. And I felt some of the other courses, they had lecturers who hadn't done it. They knew, technically, they knew photographers, they're very good at talking, but they hadn't physically done it themselves. And that was a very, very important thing, and the strength of the course, I think, that you had people who'd worked to a very, very high level. And I think it was quite unusual for, particularly David, of people who'd worked at that level to come into education, because generally, if you're a successful photographer, you stay that. You don't suddenly go and teach. I know he was working as well, but you don't suddenly go and teach people. I mean, why would you? But he had that. He had that ambition to do it. He wanted to do it, and he did it. And an awful lot of people. Well, he changed an awful lot of people's lives. He changed my life, and he changed an awful lot of people's lives. But it was the method, the simple method of doing it, that was the real power of that course, I think.
I mean, other courses at that time, so we're in the mid-70s, was it slim pickings on photography courses? I mean, I know I've heard very often Manchester come up where Parr and a few others kind of went, but they tended to be technical.
Yes, that's right. And I had no, I just didn't want to do that. The only ones I could find that was anything like what I went was Trent and Newport. And Trent sounded really interesting. Paul Hurl seemed a really nice guy, you know, and I guess I could have got, but I don't think that was 1 year. Maybe that was, I can't remember now. I didn't want to do 2 or 3 years because I didn't have time. You know, I was mid-20s, early 20s. But I didn't want to go back to college for another 3 years because I'd done 3 years. I wanted to get out and do it, you know.
So you finish the course and you get out and start doing it. So you're freelance.
Yeah.
Did you stay South Wales or were you looking for work?
No. Initially, I went to Cardiff and started living in Cardiff. And I started freelancing from Cardiff. And, you know, I started contacting newspapers and magazines. And in some way, it was an advantage because I could say, OK, I'm in Cardiff. And rather than send somebody from London, they could use me. And a lot of people in London didn't know Wales. They didn't realise that. They thought South Wales and North Wales were quite easy to get to, you know. And they'd say, "Oh, we got a job in Carnarvon or Llandudno or somewhere. Can you go there?" Okay, fine. Yeah, of course, because you're in Wales, aren't you? Oh, yeah, I can do that. Okay, I'd never tell them. It took me 5 hours to drive there. And I started working like the Radio Times, I think, was my first job. Every week they had a Welsh page and they had a Welsh feature. So my first job was in fact, that was to go up to Mid Wales, I think, and photograph somebody. And I had to hire a car because I had no transport. And anyway, I did that. And so I started working for them quite regularly. Then I started working there's a very good magazine called New Society. I don't know if you remember that. Black and white, and that was lovely because it did really interesting stories. They had a lovely picture editor. I used to say, well, okay, I'll go there. What do you want? You know, he said, oh, just take some nice pictures. Wow, you know, how good does that get? So they were lovely.
Were they trusting you on your own at that point, or were writers coming out to?
It varies. Sometimes it was totally on my own. There's no writer. I started working for The Guardian, and I did start working with who was a Guardian writer who went on to become an MP. God, I can't remember her name now. They'll come to me. I started working with her, and that was good because she was very experienced and she helped me a lot. And also, sometimes it was quite nice working writers because they would talk to somebody, I could photograph them. You know, I didn't have to do that. So, in many ways, that was nice.
That's very often that very good distraction, isn't it, of eye lines being kept somewhere else, and particularly
with good journalists who understand what photographers want. So they know where you want to sit, they know where the light is, and they know what to say to get somebody perhaps to produce a animated response where you can get something interesting. So the good journalists who knew what photographers wanted were really nice to work with. I learned a lot from that. What I didn't want to do was work for local. I didn't want to work for local Cardiff or Welsh space.
But were you doing local work?
No. Well, I was shooting local stories, but I wasn't working for local organisations.
That's a bit feisty, Steve.
I know, because I didn't want to. I wanted to get out. You know, I wanted to work nationally. I wanted to work internationally. So I thought, there's no point doing that. You know, it's not gonna help me. And I thought I would meet picture ed. So you
were conscious of that network.
Very conscious,
to
yes.
start early.
So I made a big effort to go to London to see picture editors and to make a relationship with them, because I thought, well, okay, if I move to London, they will know me. So, I won't be just another photographer. So from day one, I always tried to do that. I never worked for people like local publications and things. Not because, I met their photographers and they were lovely and they were very good, and, I'd meet them on jobs, and I loved that. I learned from them, but it's not what I wanted to do.
So you were still in Cardiff, but you were now moving around, going to London? Shooting jobs all over then, was it, the UK?
Yeah, but also because, people didn't know me, I was having to put up ideas. So I would source the local, I used to get about 4 newspapers a day, source the local stories, ring up the Guardian or the Observer or whoever I work for, say, look, I think there's a good story in Llanelli or wherever, can I go and do it? If they weren't interested, they would probably say, okay, we'll put up a bit of money, go and do it, show us the pictures, and if we use them, we'll pay you space rate, fine. Otherwise, they'd say, oh yeah, that's a good story, okay, we'll commission you. So then I'd get all expenses. So it was a combination. A lot of work I did on spec. I paid for myself, I did it and said, look, I've got the picture, shall I show them to you? And I did that.
How embedded in professional photography then was pitching and coming up with story ideas?
Well, I don't think, it comes back to Newport. That's what we were taught. It's all about ideas. There are lots and lots of very, very good photographers around. We're not short of good photographers. What we are short of is ideas. If you're the photographer that can come up with the ideas, the picture editors take note of that. Because they can ring up anybody around the country and say, go and shoot. They can do that, no problem. But the photographers that, seemed to me there were 2 types of photographers. Ones that came up with the ideas and the ones that waited for the phone to go. And I became conscious of that. And I wanted to be the, because I was interested in ideas. I'd read newspapers, listen to the news, every news channel. So I was aware and I wanted to go and learn about that particular thing. So the only way of doing it, if I could go and photograph it, that was wonderful, because the access, you know about this, the access that photography gives you is like no other profession. It's the best profession in the world if you're interested in people and travel and all that. There's nothing like it. And I got sort of obsessed with it, and nothing else seemed to matter. I wasn't interested in anything really apart from doing it, which obviously it doesn't help you in relationships and all that stuff. But anyway, it's another matter. But that's all I wanted to do, and I was obsessed.
So in those mid-70s then, you've left the course, you're out freelancing. Were you acutely conscious of when you weren't out with a camera? Were you just expecting to be out there?
That's all I did. I was always out with a camera. At Christmas, I'd go off and do something. But also, which I perhaps should mention, I got an artist in residency at Llanover Hall Arts Centre. And because, financially it was a struggle. I had no money, I had no, so to try and earn a living as a photographer was difficult. So I managed to get an artist in residency at Llanover Hall, and so they paid a bit of money. And what I had to do was produce a body of work, which I had to devolved a bit of teaching darkroom, but also to put contact sheets up, and so people could see it and I could talk about my work and then give a talk and exhibition at the end. And like a lot of newcomers to South Wales, I become sort of obsessed with the valleys. The valleys was just a magical place, and so I was up the valleys a lot. So I decided to do a project on Penrhys, which you may well know, which is this housing estate between the 2 Rhondda valleys. So I would go up there 3 or 4 times a week, shoot, put the contacts up and do that. And in fact, I lived up there for 2 months. Somebody let me stay in their house. And I did, it was all black and white, a nice body of work on Penrhys, which was used in an exhibition and shown around. So that, that also helped financially. But I was starting to do a bit more national work now, because some of the editors will say, okay, can you go to, I know, the Southwest or the Midlands or so. And gradually, they did start calling me. So it starts with you call them. They think, okay, this guy, he's not the world's best, but he's okay, he's reliable. He will come back with something, as long as you didn't screw up. And then they will start calling you. So I thought, okay, this is more interesting, because I was, starting to travel more, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. And I was working for BBC Wales. I did their international rugby for them. The Arts Council. The Arts Council were a great client because they had money, and they gave me some lovely jobs. One of the early jobs was to photograph the 56 group of artists, which was a group of about 8 or 10 artists throughout Wales who were. Obviously, they started in 56, and they were kind of an alternative group of artists who wanted to show in different galleries and not be part of the establishment. You know, people like Ewan Balla, I think Heinz Capel was a really interesting guy, Arthur Giardelli. I think Harry Holland might have been one, I can't remember now.
Is that group still going?
Well, funnily enough, I did Google it this morning, and they have like a contemporary 56 group, which obviously I don't think is not the original artist. So I think it is going in some, but in a different form. And I think they had an exhibition recently.
I think we're talking about the same thing. The photographer Bernard Mitchell, who's based over Swansea.
Yes, I know Bernard. Yeah.
Was part of an exhibition. It could be that exhibition, and it was held in Brecon in the the gallery and museum in Brecon. Well, that's interesting. So. Because Bernard's been continuing photographing artists and poets and photographers in Wales.
Yeah, I know. In fact, he used to submit to the Photolibrary Wales. Very interesting guy.
We'll come to that.
So the other thing that started was S4C. S4C started there. Yeah. And so I went along to see them, because I don't speak Welsh. I'm not Welsh, obviously. But what I persuaded them to do was let me photograph. They were working out how do they put programs together and what do they do in between programs. So I said, why don't you let me shoot the segues in between? So I will take a Welsh subject like castles in Wales or whatever, and I will shoot a set of pictures and you can just put them together, right? And that will be your segue into the next program. And the guy there called Chris Grace, who was
head of animation eventually.
Eventually, with Sirion and all that. But he was in charge. I don't know what his official title was. Really encouraging guy. And so he said, okay. So I would just go off around Wales, shoot these pictures of anything I wanted, really, put them together, and they'd pay me. I thought, this is good. So that was a revenue stream.
How long did you do that?
Not that long, probably 6 months, because it got to the point where I thought, he's not going to keep paying me, because he was paying me quite a lot. So in the end, I went to Chris and say, look, before you tell me, I think I should stop. And he said, I'm really glad you said that, because we're running out of money.
Right, so broadcasting, anything that has that institutional flavour, how did that work in terms of licensing? Did they want, because those images, I'm guessing, would be a valuable part of a picture library within.
You talk about S4C?
Yeah.
Oh, not then. No, I kept everything. Come back to Newport again. I know that incredible lesson he taught. Never give copyright away. And that has stuck with me since day one.
I think that was very much part of the founding ethos of Magnum, wasn't it, as well, at the time, was for the photographers to try and retain.
I think so.
Rights.
I mean, I don't know an awful lot about Magnum, but, that was David's things and John's thing, that unless you want to be a staff photographer, which I never wanted to be a staff photographer, no. For some reason, I couldn't give my pictures away. It's like they were so important to me, and being a photographer was such a kind of person. It wasn't a job, it was a life, and I wasn't going to give my pictures away that I'd worked hard for and I'd invested a lot of emotion and time and money in. There's no way I was going to give them to some, not idiot, but I wasn't going to, who didn't, they were going to, what are they going to do? They sit in some drawer? No way.
Did you stick to that through your career?
Always. I've never, apart from, occasionally you have to because you're desperate for money, but generally 95% of the time I would never do that, which will tie in with Photolibrary Wales, but I'll maybe come on to that.
But there's a little segue. I mean, this is an important point, isn't it? Because it still goes on today. Welsh government, for example, many
don't
photographers,
get me onto that, please.
the tourism, the tourist agency in Visit Wales, as it is now, they want to bag those copyright and the rights to any of the images. And I get that they would like to do them again, but why would you want to have ownership? Why not come up with a license agreement that makes everyone happy?
I mean, you know, if we get onto Photolibrary Wales, then that's one of the reasons it folded. But I will guess the battles I had.
Right, let's stick to the good times then.
But what I will mention in Cardiff was another interesting thing I did was, because I was always putting up ideas, I heard that Cardiff were going to twin with Xiamen in China, and they were going to send a delegation over to China. I thought, this is interesting, maybe I could get on that. So I contacted the chief exec and said, look, if I do an exhibition of Cardiff, can I come with you? I'll photograph the ceremony, I'll put the exhibition up in Xiamen, I will photograph Xiamen when I'm there. When the return delegation comes back to Cardiff, I will put that exhibition in Cardiff so that people can see it. I'm not sure about this. Anyway, eventually he said, okay, you can come. So I went to Xiamen. There was chief exec of the executive, there was the Lord Mayor, there was the Dean of the university, and a couple of businessmen. And we went to China. And we went to Hong Kong to get the connecting flight, but the weather was bad and we couldn't get a flight. We had to take a bus from Hong Kong to Xiamen, which is a bit of a trip, and it's a lot of rural roads. And so we made this trip overland, and they were lovely. Cause I remember that, because they knew I needed a lot of photographs. So if the Lord Mayor saw something interesting out the window, he'd stop the bus. I'd get out. I'd photograph, pigs being taken on to market upside down on the back of bikes and things. Lovely, lovely pictures. Because there's no tourists, and we could do anything because we were on an official bus. I could do anything. And we did that, and I did the exhibition, came back. So things like that, I was always looking for opportunities that, there's no way is anybody call me up and say, oh, hello, we gather you're a photographer, would you like to come with? No way. So again, with that philosophy for Newport, ideas, you don't have to be that good, but if you've got the good ideas, you'll be successful. And that's always stuck with me.
So in coming out of the course then from Newport, living in Cardiff, freelancing, making those connections, getting the networking going, getting more, I guess, exposure to picture editors and writers. In Wales, were you and other photographers, was there a kind of social scene for photographers, both within the course and outside of the course? What was happening in South Wales at the time?
Yes, there was, and but it was, we were quite young, sort of early 20s, and so we met other photographers, and I met other photographers. The nice thing about doing sort of news feature stuff is that you meet photographers on jobs. So you'd meet, you talk, you have a coffee, you talk about cameras and all this kind of stuff. So you would become friends, but. Also you'd meet other people who were not necessarily doing the same as what you were doing, but they were photographers. So there was a scene. CHEPSTOW was a big sort of nucleus for people that were interested in the arts, obviously, but visual arts and photography. Mm-hmm. So often we'd meet together there, in the bar, have a beer. But I can't say it was a big scene, but it certainly was quite we did encourage each other. What I didn't like about it was that the people that were working there professionally were not keen on doing that because they didn't want another photographer on their patch. When I applied to join the NUJ, I was blocked by existing photographers who said, we don't want another freelance. I will block. And I had a real problem getting in the NUJ in Cardiff because several photographers I won't mention said,
Seriously?
Oh, absolutely. They blocked me for over a year because it was a fairly small area, and they didn't want another person coming in. So I tended to, which is another reason why I wanted to start making contacts in London and abroad, because I don't want this. I can't handle this. But we did meet a lot at in CHEPSTOW, and I started meeting other photographers. And that was very because also I was desperate to talk to photographers. I didn't know anything. I wanted to learn. And so I want, what are you doing? What camera are you using? How do you get that? Where do you get that processed? I needed all of that because, as a freelance, you're very, very on your own. I had no support mechanism around me. I didn't have a sort of a mentor. David and John were very helpful. I could go back to them and they said, come back anytime, we will help you. And they did. But, I still had to survive on my own as a freelance. So there's only so much they could do.
So you did the course 1976. I believe from Robert Greetham's notes of what was happening back then, which are very useful. The following year, 77, I think through to 78, the people involved in the Newport course crept across the bridge, and suddenly there were the extramural department at Cardiff College, as it was then. These lectures were beginning to happen, organised by Hurn to bring people like Bert Hardy, Don McCullen in.
Oh, at the university?
Yes.
Yes, well...
So was that a bit of a social... Why was that creeping over?
Okay.
I've never asked David this, actually. Why suddenly
This is
was
a series
Newport
of
coming
lectures
to
he
Cardiff?
organised at Cardiff University. Okay. At Cardiff University, as far as I understand it, as far as I can remember, there was a series of lectures on photography that they did within the university every week or whatever. And
according to Robert's notes, I think there were 18 of these sessions.
Well, I think I'm talking before that started. And I remember talking to David about this, and I think he obviously was aware of these were going on, and I think he sort of looked at what they were doing, who was doing it, and I think he said something like to the university, like, "This isn't very good." Tipping. And they said, "Why isn't it very good?" So he said, "Well, it's not very good because of this and this." And they said, "Well, can you do it better?" Okay, and he did. So he started. Then, of course, he got all his contact, all the people he knew, McCartney and all these people, and Ian Berry and So he said, "Okay, I will see if they will come and do a lecture." And because we did stay in quite close contact really after I left, he asked me and said, "Would you do the exhibition relating to the upcoming lecture?" So we'd pick a photographer, I don't know, and then he'd say, "Okay, can you get prints and mount them and put them on this one of the corridors in the university the week before the exhibition so people can see it and on their way and do it." And say it was Bill, no, it wouldn't be Bill Brandt, but I don't know, say it was Ian Berry. And we had some money to do it because the university had a budget. So what I would do, I would go and buy books of a photographer, and I would cut the pages out. And I'd mount them and put them on the wall, because it was the cheapest way of doing it. I couldn't get original prints. Obviously David had some, but maybe he didn't have enough to do the whole show. And I'd put them on the wall. And I did that for all the shows. And then, he had... and then these photographers would come up and they would do the talk. I mean, David did some, I think John did some, maybe Kit Arnott did some. A talk about an aspect of photography or their work, and they were really successful in terms of the amount of people that we had in the lecture theatre. They were, nearly full. It was very, very successful, and so I did.
Can you recall what kind of numbers are we talking about?
There must. God, it's difficult. There must have over 100.
Wow, really?
Oh yeah, in the lecture theatre, it was good because he got, his students were obviously there, students from other photographers, but because there was this, nucleus of photographers, and And there were academics, but people that were just interested in photography or the name of that person. I know, he persuaded Don McCullum to do one.
Tom Hopkinson, I think.
Tom Hopkinson did one, but I remember I had to get Don McCullum's pictures, and then he rang me up about a week before, and he says, "I'm awfully sorry, I've got a job, I can't do it." But David got Ian Berry to step in, and Ian did, so things like that happened. But that was interesting for me, because I was meeting these, really top people. So for me, that was wonderful. But also, I was meeting and talking to other photographers, and that was the nucleus of the Photogallery.
So the early days of Photogalery would have been, I would have thought, very interesting. It sounds there was a lot going on. There was people meeting up. These lectures were happening. Was there a buzz being created in terms of what you could do with photography in Wales?
There certainly was. There was a buzz. There was an excitement and a feeling that we could achieve something, because there didn't seem to be anything in terms of where photographers could get together and talk about their work and other people's work, encourage each other, and just basically talk about photography, really. And CHEPSTOW was the obvious place to go, because obviously in the centre of Cardiff, and it was a social place, so you could have a beer and chat and all that. And I remember going there in the bar and talking to a few people there. I think what we did, I remember saying to people, look, why don't we meet up in the bar on a Wednesday evening or something, and we'll have a beer and we'll talk about it. And I remember people like David Williams and a few others, we did that. And then I thought, well, why don't we persuade CHEPSTOW to have an exhibition in CHEPSTOW of people's work? And because I was doing quite a lot of photography for CHEPSTOW, I was photographing exhibitions, and I was photographing the visiting performances and some of the artists that had studios there. I was doing a bit. So I knew the people who ran CHEPSTOW, and I persuaded them, look, if I put some freestanding columns in the foyer, a different building then, it had a foyer sort of in the middle. If I do that, and we put every month or so, we put a photographer's up and then we change it, would you be in agreement? And they said, yeah, okay. So how do we do this? And I remember talking to David about it, and I said, and he said, well, look, I've got this exhibition which I've got. It's my pictures, but they're already mounted. They weren't glass mounted, but they were kind of mounted on like a hard wood, or if I remember right. So it had no glass. And so he gave me those. I put those up as a very first exhibition. So we started a little buzz. Then I think the next one, I said, well, look, okay, why don't we all put some of our own pictures up? So we had like a group show. I remember doing that. And then we got a few more, and then it became, okay, we can't keep doing this, because, we need to expand it. We need to make it a bit more permanent. And I think it was moved every time they cleaned or something. So then it obviously did go into develop where you were talking about with the larger groups meeting and it becoming, how do we get finance? The only way we could work finance was to get the Arts Council involved. And because also I'd worked for the Arts Council, I knew Peter Jones not well, but I knew him, and also another guy who worked with him very good called Andrew, whose surname I forget. They were very supportive, and they were interested in photography, and so we did start to have meetings. And I think you mentioned Pinhole there, which became a working title, I think, and the numbers of people increased from, I think, 3 or 4 of us sitting in the bar to 40 or 50 sitting in a sort of a proper meeting where you had to take minutes and all that kind of stuff, because we had to structure it if we were going to get a grant from the Arts Council. And people with other skills that I didn't have became involved, who could do that, who could formulate a proposal better. So then we had to source a building, and I remember going along with David Williams, and we found this building, and we talked to the builder who owned it and said, could we rent it? So he agreed, but it needed painting inside, so we painted it inside, by which time the Arts Council had provisionally agree to fund it. So that came through, so we could open it, and it, I was heavily involved in it, but I was certainly by no means the only person. There was a team of people, and we shared the workload.
So this first building would have been the first Photogallery building on Charles Street.
That's right. It was like a wooden structure, strange structure. It was set back from the road, as you probably remember. It had parking in front of it, and it was a strange building, but it worked okay as a gallery. It was a bit cold in the winter, but we painted all the walls, and we started putting up exhibitions there. And because I thought, well, I've got to put a lot of time into this to make it work, and a lot of other people did as well, an awful lot of time, and we'd have committee meetings and we'd have arguments and all this. And I think one of the first exhibitions we put up was on Soviet war photography, which I'd seen somewhere. It's amazing pictures from, I guess it was the Second World War, shot in Russia by Russian photographers, and hardly been seen anywhere. That was an incredible black and white show. Then I think we had a group show, and we had a few more shows. And then I think I sort of realised, okay, I can't devote this amount of time anymore. I don't really want to be involved in running a gallery. I'm trying to be an international photographer. I can't do two. So I started bowing out, really. And there were, people with more experience and skills than I had became more involved. And also, I had a feeling that it was starting to take a different direction from the original direction that we had of it encouraging Welsh photography, not necessarily, or images have been shot in Wales. Didn't have to be particularly living in Wales, but we felt if it was Welsh Arts Council, it should do that. So before I left, we thought, okay, we've got to have a director. So we advertised for a director, and we had applications, and then we interviewed. And the person who got the job was a guy called Bill Messer and I think he'd been running a gallery in London. And he was very impressive. He spoke very well. He seemed to buy into what we were saying we wanted, although he wasn't Welsh and didn't have experience of Welsh photographers. He seemed to have the skills and the expertise we needed to make it a serious gallery. So he got the job. And by that time, I was working a lot in London, but I was coming back to Cardiff because I had a base there. So I'd keep in contact and find out what was happening. But Bill was, he wanted to travel to edit photographers' work for exhibitions. Okay, so at first we thought, okay, well, this is interesting. As it went on, we suddenly realized, hang on. This guy is traveling to really nice places, meeting interesting people, charging a fortune on expenses, and taking a big lump of the gallery's money out. Hang on, this is right. And he had his views of photography, which obviously wasn't about encouraging Welsh photographers. And things occasionally got a bit heated. I remember once, after a committee meeting, we were sitting in a pub in Cardiff somewhere, and I was sitting on this bench, and one side of me was Bill, the other side was Al Campbell. And they were having a real argument about photography and what we should be doing, and they were getting quite animated. And all of a sudden, they started throwing punches at each other. I'm sitting in the middle. Punches were raining from the left and right. What? But in a way, it was kind of good because they were passionate.
God, we need more of that today.
They were passionate about the photography, and okay, they were coming from opposing things, but in a way, it was a positive thing. So things like that happened, and then before I left, I remember then Bill left, I think, and a woman called Debbie got the job.
Debbie Baker.
Debbie Baker. Debbie got a job, and she was very good. She was interesting because she'd worked as an assistant to Ralph Gibson in New York, and she knew Ralph's work. And I looked at Ralph's work, and I thought, okay, it's not Welsh, it's not, but it's interesting, it's different. So she gave me his contact. I went over to New York. I met with Ralph. I said, look, you obviously remember Debbie and and she's now running this gallery in Cardiff, and could you give us an exhibition? And he said, sure, yeah. So I edited his work, we had the pictures, got the pictures over, and we ran a Ralph Gibson exhibition, which a serious photographer in Cardiff. It wasn't in London, it wasn't anywhere else. It was in Cardiff, and it was the only. It wasn't a touring show. Some of the other shows we had were touring shows that you obviously pay a fee for and do it. And it wasn't. It was an individual show, which gave us a bit of credibility, I think. And we started getting some write-ups in some of the nationals about this new gallery in Cardiff that was doing quite interesting things. But that really was my last contact with the gallery. Then I pretty much moved to London and concentrated on photography, really.
Well, we'll come back to Photogallery, but that move to London, I think, in terms of your career, Steve, was quite an important move as well. You seem to have an itch for doing things beyond just pressing the shutter, because you got together again with other photographers in London, and out of that sprung another collective of sorts, which was the Network Photography Agency.